content on this platform, including all WeedSmart extension products, podcasts, articles, webinars, and social media, is provided by WeedSmart for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice specific to your farming system. Always seek advice from your agronomist or other qualified providers with any questions you may have regarding specifics around herbicide use and integrating weed management into your farm system.
Good morning, everybody. This is Paul McIntosh from WeedSmart. Here with me today is Eric Koetz, Graham, Charles and Jeff Werth. And we're going to talk about winning with weeds in cotton and grain systems, a very important subject, everybody. And one thing we're not going to get rid of too easily is weeds. So with these gentlemen here today, we'll definitely get a better handle on our weeds in our farming systems. And I'd like to thank our WeedSmart partners, there's GRDC and the University of WA at the top, but all the other stakeholders are a very important part of WeedSmart in our endeavour to get on top of herbicide resistance in Australia. Thank you very much to them. And we'll start off with Eric Koetz from DPI in New South Wales. Eric's going to talk about different parts of the winning weeds within cotton and grain systems, so I'll pass it over to Eric.
Eric Koetz, I'm with New South Wales DPIRD, and I'm just going to give a bit of a rundown and a background on herbicide resistance in grains and cotton, and then a bit of work that we've done out of a project that was funded by CRDC and GRDC on regional demonstration of integrated weed tactics across farming systems. So this was a series of demonstration trials, and we identified a couple of key issues with some farmer forums, those being how to incorporate residual herbicides into the system and the use of optical sprayers. So just to sort of set the scene, there's been a number of surveys conducted over the years by Graham, Charles Jeff Werth, myself. So starting in 91 through to the present time, you can see that there's been a bit of a species shift from mainly broadleaf weeds in the 90s. And then 2001 is about the time that we had the introduction of glyphosate-tolerant cotton into Australia. So still fairly, predominantly broadleaf weeds. But about that time, we started to see a reduction in tillage, so zero till, and more of a focus on glyphosate only. So we started to see growers pulling back from using a residual program. And by the time we get to the late teens and into the 2000s, the predominant weed species that we're dealing with now are the grass weeds. There's still some broadleaf weeds there that are an issue, but our predominant weed species that we see in our surveys now are the grass weeds, hornless barnyard grass, feathertop rose grass, and windmill grass. So now to put that into perspective, we've done a series of glyphosate testing of weed seeds that we've collected over the last 8-9 years. And what you can see there, the two things that really stand out is fleabane is either 100% resistant or very highly tolerant. The alarming one is feathertop rose grass. So the surveys that we've conducted, 100% of those plants in the most recent survey, which was cotton and grains with myself and John Broster from Charles Sturt University, are resistant to glyphosate. So to put how we test that is they're grown in the glasshouse, and if you have more than 20% of the population survive, they're considered resistant. Between 10 and 20%, they're developing resistance. So those numbers are quite alarming. The annual ryegrass numbers in 17-18, that survey was solely in the southern cotton growing area. So we have a lot of annual ryegrass that's resistant to glyphosate here in the south. The 22-23 survey was more around sort of from northern New South Wales into southern Queensland. So that's why the number sort of drops away there. But as you can see, like glyphosate resistance is a real issue and something we're having to deal with. So now I'll talk about a couple of key weeds in a cereal phase, so fleabane and sow thistle. Now this modelling work was done by David Thornby using the Weed Seed Wizard. David's been involved with weeds for probably the best part of 30 years as a modeller, looking at different scenarios. So in this first one, we've got a wheat canola rotation, and it's a low input scenario, so a fairly basic approach to weed control. So what that looks like when we run the model is the first couple of years, we see quite a large reduction in harvest because we're into a double wheat phase, It's not until we start the canola phase where we've got some selective spray topping at the end to knock those weed numbers down that we see a reduction in harvest loss. So we start to see a big bounce in our crop yields, and then we move, and that lag effect only lasts for about 12 months, and then we're back into the second wheat phase, and we see large losses in harvest again. However, the grey line you can see at the bottom of the graph there is where we're using that selective spray top to control any survivors that are getting through the program at the end. So that is able to keep the numbers consistently low across a 10-year period. So we put, by relying on just a selective in-crop, we're putting a lot of pressure on that herbicide in-crop. So the spray topping is doing a lot of the work there in that model. When we contrast that with a high input scenario, so the main thing we're adding here is a double knock or a second double knock, and even as part of the WeedSmart Big Six, we're adding a competitive barley crop right at the start to try and get those weed numbers down. Not necessarily relying solely on herbicides to do all the heavy lifting. So what we can see here is that a single double knock, the green line there, takes a little while to take effect, but it does a really good job. But it takes about 5 years to get a really good effect. But when we start with a competitive crop and we have that second double knock, we see a consistent control of weeds and very little impact on harvest. And again, two double knocks gives you a similar result. It just takes a little while longer to kick in, but that competitive crop early on really does help sort of supercharge our weed control, if you like. Now, looking at the cotton space, one of the weeds that was identified as being hard to control and we thought had already been, I suppose we had a good handle on, is that ornamental barnyard grass. So this came up in a couple of forums as being really difficult to control. So in dryland cotton, we rely a lot on herbicides, obviously, and it's a less there's less margin in that compared to an irrigated crop, so it tends to be the lower cost herbicides. But so the scenarios we're looking there, and the one that is of particular interest is the last one, where we've got a very diverse rotation there, and we're using that to, I suppose, to add some diversity and complexity to the weed control system. So if we just rely solely on a minimal approach and only an early double knock, we don't get control. So those two lines there, the orange and the grey line, we get control for a couple of years, but then we start to lose the handle on barnyard grass. When we incorporate a late double knock, and then we add that complexity and diversity into the system with our bean crop or our cover crop, that's when we start to see long-term control, and we get the best, I suppose, gross margin. So we start to, it's a little bit of a slow burn early, but then once that sort of kicks into effect, that's the most profitable scenario. When we look at the irrigated cotton system, irrigation has still got quite a lot of cultivation in the system. So we're able to use cultivation, I suppose, as a non-herbicide control tactic. And here, just using a residual, initially it starts out not too bad, but then we start to lose money. Even incorporating two residuals is not doing enough over a 10-year period to gain control. It's when we have a range of tactics to target barnyard grass and that focusing on patch management and getting early and late control tactics into the system. So in effect, we're throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. So that's what the modelling has shown. So when we look at all that, and then we see, well, what's changed in the last 5 to 10 years? Well, Crop Consultants Australia do a survey every year for cotton, And in the 24-25 survey, there's been a 10 to 15% increase in the adoption of residuals compared to the same survey 5 years ago. So we now have 60% of growers using a pre-plant residual and nearly 50% of growers using an at-plant residual. And I suppose the other key thing that we've seen is there's been a 20% increase in growers that are using more than 3 non-glyphosate tactics to control weeds. So that's a move away from that glyphosate-centric system to throwing a lot more diversity and different tactics into the weed control system. And I guess the final message from my part of the webinar is it's around come clean and go clean. So farm hygiene is so important. Those delivery channels and irrigation areas, the non-farm areas, the field edges, the road and fence lines, that's where weeds can spread in. So you stop that spread. And as always with the message around the cotton industry with weeds is no survivors. So stopping seed set is the key message to drive numbers down and to take the pressure off glyphosate, which in general is working reasonably well still in crop, but it's in those outside areas where we're starting to lose that handle. So I'll leave my section there and hand over to Graham to talk more about residuals and camera sprayers. Before we go, Eric, that's a key point that area management of weeds, I suppose, area-wide management of weeds. We used to talk about it when that pilot program. It's a good point you put there about it's not just the weeds in your paddock, it's all the weeds on the edges and they can just reinfest. And it's a great point you made there for that on that particular slide for area-wide management of weeds.
I'll talk a bit about glyphosate. It's increased in importance with, I guess, initially with the introduction of the XtendFlex cotton that has the glyphosate and dicamba tolerance, but also as we're starting to see a little bit of paraquat resistance coming through in some of our species. And the pressure has shifted a little bit towards glyphosate, I guess, and it's a fairly temperamental herbicide that can get mixed results. And I guess we'll try and sort of go through the next couple of slides to try and work out how we can get a more effective general control with it. So I'll just be fairly quick on this slide. There is a Cotton Info e-news that came out with a bit more detail on how glyphosate works. So it results in, once you apply it and it gets into the plant, it causes an increase in ammonia build-up, which inhibits photosynthesis. And from that, they get what we call these reactive oxygen species, which after a little while, that when they start to build up, they start to break down the cell walls or the cell membranes. And so you get cells bursting apart, which is, in the end, is a fairly similar action to paraquat. So there are some similarities there. And I guess if you think a little bit about paraquat, how you would apply paraquat and you'd apply that to glyphosate, you'll get pretty close. So I'll jump straight into the paraquat. So it doesn't translocate very well. It causes that rupturing of cell membranes. So it's very similar. It just has those couple of initial steps in the process. The other thing we found that, like paraquat, it requires full sunlight. So you require the plant to be actively photosynthesizing to get that build-up of that reactive oxygen species and to get the cell membrane destruction. Yeah. It's also a little bit like glyphosate. It's a weak acid and it's quite water-soluble. And as a result, it doesn't absorb into the leaf very well. So it takes a long time. And because of that, the droplet needs time on the leaf surface. And that's why low humidity or high delta T situations where it can dry the droplets out quickly, you'll get limited translocation, limited penetration into the leaf in those situations. So that higher humidity, to give it that time to slowly get into the leaf is what's required. It's also quite susceptible to water hardness and pH, like glyphosate. So hard water, you'll get, reduced results. So as I said earlier, it needs good coverage with higher carrier volumes. If you can get up to that 180 to 100, that's ideal. So give it that considerable time on the leaf surface to get into the leaf. Optimal conditions, full sunlight, warm temperatures, high humidity or low delta T. Your optimum pH is around 4 to 6. If you have hard water and you're forced to use that, the addition of ammonium sulfate can help out. And then with regards to time of day, like the researchers found that applications followed by dark periods, so, applications at sunset, are probably not ideal, as that gives the plants time to compartmentalize the glufosinate in the cell, like in the vacuole. And then once it's there, it can't bind to the glutamine synthetase and after sunrise the next morning. So it's sort of in there, not really doing anything, just locked away. Also, some other research has shown that combining with some of the group 14 herbicides, because they have a similar kind of end result as they work on those reactive oxygen species as well. So that can help with that generation and help with the efficacy of both herbicides. So a couple of years ago, we did a pod study where we looked at some double knock scenarios where we used glufosinate instead of paraquat on glyphosate resistant and susceptible species populations of fleabane, sow thistle, barnyard grass, and feathertop grass, and windmill grass. So you can see there the herbicides we used. This was sort of in an extend flex framework where we used glufosinate alone, dicamba alone. We used clethodim where we had grasses and combinations of glufosinate, dicamba, and glufosinate, clethodim, and then using a double knock where we looked at similar timeframes. We wanted to see if the timeframes differed between paraquat and glufosinate in that double knock follow-up interval. And so I'll just briefly go through the results. Where we used fleabane and we had glufosinate as the double knock partner with dicamba and glufosinate and dicamba, we got 100% control right across the board, and it didn't really matter on the interval between the first application and the follow-up application. For sow thistle, similar results. We got the dicamba on its own and the glufosinate plus dicamba followed by glufosinate, or glyphosate plus dicamba followed by glufosinate. We got good control, 93 to 100%. Again, and that it was independent of that interval between applications. For feathertop roads, we got best control when we had glyphosate and clethodim followed by glufosinate at 7 and 10 day intervals. So going earlier with that follow-up, we got inconsistent results. So that 7 to 10 days seemed to be the sweet spot. Windmill grass was very particular. We did struggle to get consistent control with it, and the best we got was glyphosate and clethodim followed by glufosinate at 10-day intervals. So that's where we managed to get the best control. For the barnyard grass, we managed to control it in all situations except for, as you'd expect, glyphosate on the glyphosate-resistant population.
Thanks, Jeff. Much appreciated, mate. Some good results there with that double knock glyphosate followed by glufosinate there and dicamba mixtures. There were some really good results there, so well done, mate. So we'll move over now to Graham.
So one of the things that Eric talked about very much was the need to use more residual herbicides in the system. And Our resistance work clearly shows that that's a requirement. One of the downsides of residual herbicides is that they have a habit of remaining residual a bit longer than we want sometimes. And it's a bit of an unknown just how long residual herbicides will hang around. That's particularly the case when we start looking at residuals put through optical sprayers where the rate may be above the standard rate. I think it would be a reasonable thing to say that many optical sprayers would have a rate of about 2x that's commonly used, twice the standard rate. But the problem is that with an optical sprayer, you might have one nozzle shooting, and that's all good, it's giving you 2x, but if two nozzles are triggered and they're overlapping, part of that is actually getting 4x, and potentially with three nozzles, you could be getting as high as 8x, the intended rate. As to the plant back from those sort of rates, we just have no information on the label to guide us. So with CRDC support, I did 3 years of work looking at high rates through optical spray. It wasn't actually through an optical spray, it was through a normal spray boom, but looking at high rates, applied in a fallow 3 to 4 months prior to cotton, and then go to cotton in an irrigated scenario. So the herbicides I used were Balance, Sharpen, Starone Advanced, Valor, 2,4-D-amine, and Veraxor. Now, obviously, there are plenty more herbicides that could have been on that list. It's just you can't do everything, and that's the group that were counted. Now, if we look at the plant back on the label from those products at their 1x rate, Balance, we were foul of that plant back. The rest of them were all fine, so there should have been no problem with a 4 months application at the 1x rate with all of those products, except for Balance. And Balance, we're just saying, look, the thing happened, you were planning to put chickpeas in, and for whatever reason, it's now planning to go to cotton. But these things happen. So what are the consequences? Just looking at half the group at a time, it's important to see the big picture here. So if we look at Balance, for example, at a 1x rate, there was a small yield reduction, but it wasn't consistent over the 2, 4, and 8x rates particularly. So it's probably not a real result, that first one. Even though it was done over 3 years, things still happen. But certainly by the time you got to 4 and 8x rates of Balance, it is starting to affect cotton plant back or cotton yield. We're looking at the effect there on the first column of the number of cotton plants established per metre, then the height and dry weight, and that was done in late November. So plants are about 2 months old, and then final yield. And then data has been presented by highlighting in pink the results that were statistically significantly worse than the nil treatment. So just talked about Balance. With Sharpen at the 0, 2, and 4x rates caused some reduction in plant growth, early plant growth, but didn't affect yield. But at the high rate, it's affected everything. That's a 50% reduction in plant stand, more than 50% reduction in height, dry weight, and then yield. So big effect of Sharpen. It's not nice on cotton. I guess that's not hugely surprising. The surprising one is the next one, Styrone. Remembering that Styrone had a 28-day plant back to cotton with some proviso around rainfall, but over the 3 years of these trials, there was reasonable rainfall on 2 out of the 3 years. The 2x rate of Styrone has affected plant stand. Once we get to a 4x rate of Styrone, it's affected everything. 8x worse. So this product with the 28-day plant back and the 2x rate should have been fine, you would naively think, given that it was put on more than double that 28 days prior to cotton. But there's damage there. Go on to the other products. Valor, which is a product that we're routinely using now in and around cotton. The 2x rate Valor actually reduced yield. It didn't at the other rate. So again, that's probably an anomalous result. But 2,4 and 8x rates of Valor definitely affected plant stand and affected early seedling growth. So all I'm saying here is that the data that I've got from 3 years' experiment would suggest that Valor may not be as safe as you would think. The next set of herbicides were Valor, Vraxor, and 2,4-D. Valor, which is a product which has now been commonly used in and around the cotton industry, gave a surprising amount of early season damage, both affecting plant stand and early season growth. Didn't affect yield, but some warning signs there around Valor used prior to cotton. It has the potential to cause damage. Vraxor, pretty nasty on cotton. And again, that was actually the 1x rate was used within the label plant back. There's no issue according to the label plant back, but we have at 1x significant effects on plant height, plant stand, and dry weight of early season. And then once we get to the higher rates, there's big effects. So the 8x rate of Vraxor basically left bare plots. There was almost nothing there. So a real warning sign on that. Now, I guess the one that I expected to be damaging was 2,4-D. So 2,4-D is a product which we commonly see damage from winter applications under the following cotton crop. Now, I've been able to replicate that many times in experiments, but in this particular experiment, even at the 8x rate, it's had almost no impact on the cotton over 3 years. So the lesson from all that is that the whole herbicide breakdown thing is very complex. We have a herbicide and we know that its breakdown is predicted to be whatever. But the problem is that is affected very much by its solubility, its placement, and nobility. So where does the herbicide end up in the profile? If it's sitting in the surface and we have a dry season, then there's no moisture to break it down. On the other hand, if it's washed down into the profile, then there may be no microbial activity to break it down. So herbicides, depending where they end up, can have quite a different breakdown response. Soil moisture is really critical, but it's about where that herbicide is. Soil temperature, the warmer it is, the quicker something breaks down. So breakdown over winter will be minimal compared to summer. Soil pH, some herbicides are affected a lot more than others. And then we've got a whole heap of other things like soil texture, organic matter, binding, biological activity I mentioned earlier, history of use. There's a lot of factors that go into determining herbicide breakdown. The other side is herbicide damage. Obviously, crops vary in their sensitivity, and it's to do with plant size, the plant growth rate at the time it meets the herbicide. There can be some varietal differences in plants. Herbicide rate is directly related to herbicide breakdown, but it's not, as the results from the data just showed, it's not a simple equation. It's all about the herbicide rate at the point of root absorption, the amount that's actually absorbed. Is the herbicide in a concentrated band near the surface, or is it washed into the profile? Is it concentrated in a band or diluted down the profile? It's generally with herbicides, it's a plus or minus scenario that it will kill or it won't kill a plant. But what we're saying is that plants that will survive an amount of herbicide can readily be damaged by it. So it's really not a plus or minus. There's a whole range there of herbicide damage from sub-lethal doses. Just wanted to show there an example of what we're talking about with camera spray rates. Now, remembering that in my data that 2,4-D didn't cause issues in cotton. This is a shot from a commercial field, and it looks like reasonable cotton until you look closely that the row to the right of centre there is actually damaged. And when you walk through this field, you discover that there was 10 or 15 metre pieces of cotton or pieces of row that were damaged, and the rows on both sides are undamaged. That's the cotton in that little bit of row. That was all from optical sprayer. So even though my results showed no issues with 2,4-D, all of these herbicides have the potential to cause problems. And I guess the bottom line that I'd like to say is that from our herbicide resistance management strategy, we know that growers will need to be using more residual herbicides, but just make sure that you're aware that things can go wrong, particularly in the northern cropping area where seasons can vary so much. We can have dry or wet at any time of the year. Some of these residual herbicides have the potential to cause a lot of crop damage to the following crop. Thank you, Paul.
All right. So we've seen from the presentation the background information on how weed species have changed, what our glyphosate resistance issues are, the role that glufosinate can now play going forward to control some of those weeds in the double knock scenario, especially as the use pattern around paraquat is changing. So glufosinate, the work that Jeff presented on glufosinate, I think will become very, very important, and we need to focus on that. And then Graham's work with the camera sprayers. Like there are some pitfalls with using some of those high rates, but also the advantage of being able to go out and mop up those patches, especially as technology changes and we can drop pins and map those hotspots in fields, and then we can go out and only spray the areas in the paddock that we're really targeting, those escapes. So still focusing on the no survivors and stopping seed set no matter what. And we touched on the cotton herbicide resistance management strategy. And I think the important thing there is, whilst we talk about 6 modes of action across 2 years, including the fallow and the rotation crop, Graham mentioned that it's important that we look at 6 effective weed control tactics. So if we're dealing with multiple herbicide-resistant species, be they grasses or broadleaf, that could in fact be 7, 8 or 9 different control tactics that we're going to have to employ before the horse, bolts out of the stable. So I think the one thing that this project, the CRDC, GRDC project has shown is that we have a very diverse and dynamic system, and that's the thing that has allowed us to stay on top of weed resistance.
I'd just like to thank our guests here today, Jeff Werth, Eric Koetz and Graham Charles. It was an excellent webinar, gentlemen. We've all learned a lot, and we'll continue to learn more from you, gentlemen, as we march on into the future with our complex farming systems across a few crops that we've mentioned today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.